Well, welcome to Thursday afternoon Bible study in the Gospel of Mark. I'm Charlie Hara, pastor of Christ Church, a new church beginning in Upper Township, New Jersey. And this Sunday at 10:30 at the Seaville Fire Company, the banquet hall, we're holding our first in-service, in-person, in the building services. So if you care to join us, you need to go online in order to make a reservation because of COVID restrictions and the requests from the fire company. We're keeping it at 75 people. If you can't make it, please, I implore you to pray for us. It's going to start getting interesting, and the Lord's mercies are everlasting and on us new every day. We're grateful for the privilege, but if you think starting a church is a challenge, try doing it in the middle of a pandemic. And yet the Lord has been faithful the whole way. We greet you. We're coming from Seashore Community Church of the Nazarene, and they have graciously given us this place to call home for a season and a time. For that, we're very grateful to Pastor Tim West. We're studying the Gospel of Mark, as I said. We're in the 7th chapter, verses 31 to 37. We finish up the 7th chapter, Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise. Let me read it for you. And for those that are in with us, Chris has put a microphone in the middle so questions can actually be recorded, and you will be probably blackmailed, and money will be raised that way for Christ Church for what you say. Let me read then from the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel, verses 31 to the end of the chapter. Hear the word of God, brothers and sisters. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought a man to him who was deaf and could hardly speak. And they begged him to place his hand on the man. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened. His tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He makes even the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Allow me then to read it from Matthew chapter 15. Just listen to it. Keep your finger in Mark 7. Here's Matthew's version of it. He adds a couple of things to it. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up to the hills and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the dumb, and many others. And they laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the dumb speaking, the crippled made well, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they praised God, the God of Israel. Doesn't add a lot, but some of the interesting things he does add is that it wasn't just this one man in this. It was a group of them, and the way he describes them as blind, deaf, dumb, crippled, helps cast the story, as it were. The other thing you need to see is John tells you he goes up into the hill. Matthew tells you he went up into the hills. You get that if you know your geography in Mark's gospel, but Matthew puts that little detail on that all of this took place up into the hills. What's fascinating in Mark's, I'll simply give you this note, and then we'll get your observations on this passage. I'm all right. Don't panic, anybody. I will get it out. It's COVID. You know, I'm dealing with post-COVID vaccination. I'll blame everything the rest of my life on the fact that I was vaccinated. What Mark tells you is he left Tyre and Sidon, and they sort of meander down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. That is probably the longest circuitous route. He's meandering, as it were. If you trace it, he goes from the coast of the Mediterranean and goes down and into other regions, and then finally meanders into Galilee. And Sea of Galilee, again, is that almost circular-like body of water. He meanders over to the eastern shore of that, and the Decapolis is that 10 cities, that's what Decapolis means, that he meanders to. That little tidbit is enough to get a whole discussion going, but I'll stop and say, as I read Mark and then I read Matthew, what stands out for you here? What is noteworthy and something that you'd like to comment on? Anyone?
Matthew's version ended with they praise the Lord.
Yeah, yeah, it doesn't. They're amazed at it, and yeah, but Matthew does punctuate it. That's another one of those little details. And when you think about where we are, Teresa, it brings it even into more clarity, and that becomes even more delightful, their response to it all. Anybody else? So make sure I hit on that. I hear you, and you nailed it. That was the other thing that you needed to note. And not only other people besides this one deaf man, many of them, they're being laid at his feet, and the response, they do correspond. Mark says they were amazed at it. He does everything well, but the Matthew's version of it is they praise God over it, which is noteworthy. Anybody?
Well, he hadn't tried to fly.
Yeah.
By not saying anything.
And I want you to keep in mind, and we'll try and drive it out, the reason he took that circular route to come down out of the Galilee, out of the Gentile territory of Syria and down is the same reason he's doing this. Go ahead, Steve. What's that?
To avoid the Pharisees.
You got it. Yeah. To avoid the Pharisees. Yeah, they have been hounding him, almost literally hounding him, chasing him, and looking for things to start up on. Right. And here is another one. Because if you touch cripples and blind and the leprous and what have you, that causes you to become unclean. And what you have, if you study all four of the Gospels, is Jesus going down in Jerusalem and making some teachings down there. You got to put all four of them together to get the complete picture. He's been doing that, and that's one of the reasons all the Pharisees in Jerusalem keep following him. But if that's the case, they don't want him anywhere near the temple. He's bringing contaminants. It's as though you have a COVID patient here that shows up without a face mask, and he's just spreading his vileness, because if you're unclean and you touch somebody that is clean, they become unclean. So he's one giant contaminant. He's Typhoid Mary on 2 feet. Yes. Yes, it is. I think a very good one. And again, think what he's been telling us. It's not what's on the inside that makes a man unclean. It's not what's on the outside that makes a man unclean. It's what's on the inside. And here Jesus bringing in the things that every Jew would have been sensitive to, just like our COVID mask. Whatever else, we don't want to get any spittle on us. He's intentionally, in diseased situations, spitting on them to show that he isn't contaminant. He isn't a contaminator. He's not vile. There's no uncleanness in him. In fact, when he spits on you, you get better. So we should have factored that in before Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Maybe Jesus spitting on us would be a good thing. But there's more where that came from, Steve, and let's explore all of those things. Anything else stand out for you? Because this one's packed full, as you would expect. It's just packed full of stuff, and it's really delightful things. Anything else stand out for you? Well, let's start with Teresa's observation and the opening here. He goes into the Decapolis. When was the last time we saw Jesus in the Decapolis? It's the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. So if you think of the Sea of Galilee, it's fairly round in shape.
Chased after demons in caves.
Yes. That was where the Gadarene demoniac was. That's where, what was the outcome of that miracle of him exorcising the demons out of the Gadarene demoniac? What was the response of the people?
They chased him away, put the wine on into the cave.
Yeah,
Take away the livelihood.
you got it. I mean, whatever else, the pork belly futures fell drastically in that commodity. Yeah, and they wanted him out. This is the same area. And that's why your observation from Matthew's that they saw what was going on and they praised God for it. Made the difference. They couldn't get him out of town fast enough in the 5th chapter. Here at the end of the 7th chapter, separated by weeks, couple of maybe 2 or 3 weeks at most. Now they can't get enough. And now they're bringing other sick people out. What made the difference? The priests weren't there. Where did they get the notion that he was important, that Jesus could do something? Where'd they get that notion? Put the 2 stories together. They got rid of him after the healing of the Gadarene demoniac. He comes back into that area now, and now they don't want to let go of him. What made the difference? Or, yeah, that's the big one. And yeah, the priests aren't there because they're afraid of all these contaminants. Plus, if we're right about our geography, this was predominantly a Gentile area. This is where the Roman soldiers were. They were garrisoned in all of these areas. So yeah, you've got probably a less Jewish. They're still there because he's wanting to do this privately for some reason. But don't discount that one man who wanted to go along with Jesus, and Jesus telling him, no, you stay here and go back to your family and tell them the mercies of the Lord and the good things the Lord has done for you. And he did that. I'd hold for you that crazy, naked, screaming lunatic who lived in the graveyard was one of the most effective evangelists and certainly one of the first missionaries, as it were, ever. The guy got it done. It just makes it.
Peer pressure also.
How so?
Well, I mean, if you don't have all the priests and everybody else, all these so-called good people,
Paid professional holy men? Yeah.
they're telling you that, I mean, it's like a politician coming in here, whoever, and sitting next to you and telling you, well, we want to do this for this, and this. Well, okay. But then the other guy comes in, the other guy sits by you and says, no, it's not right. You got to do what God tells us to do.
Yeah. And if you're reading it right, and I think you got something there as well with the Jewish end of this, whatever else, the key leaders and the prominent religious leaders, they're not wanting to get around this guy nor that region for anything. I mean, this is one giant 3 Mile Island kind of contamination. So, you don't deal with him. Do you have any idea who he is? He's the formerly possessed crazy man that was naked and cutting himself and couldn't be chained. He was Superman with demons in him. So, yeah, they've distanced themselves quite far. And here's then Jesus with the lone witness. So, yeah. How does, and before we get to the spit, Steve, how did he heal this man? How did he heal this man? Show me what he did first and then second and third. Yeah, he puts his fingers in his ears. Remember, when we're studying the New Testament, we want to keep one ear open. We want half of our brain to be thinking of the former things, listening for Old Testament stories. So here is a deaf and dumb man who could barely speak. He has returned to Israel now. Yeah, it's got a lot of Gentiles, but you get the idea. In the earliest days, it was a rare exception for him to be ministering to Gentiles. He does it, but he's come primarily for Israel. What's the point of that? I'm going to presume this guy is true blue Jew through and through. If he's true blue Jew through and through, what couldn't he have served as? If you have any kind of deformity in Israel, what couldn't you do? Priest. Now, I don't know that he's in the tribe of Aaron and Levite and all of that, but I know this. I'll give you the passage. We don't have to look it up. It's Exodus 19:6. God's plan all along. Exodus 19 is right before the giving of the law and the plan of the tabernacle and all of that. Exodus 19:6 says, I want Israel to be a whole nation of priests. So all along, the temple, the tabernacle, and the priesthood under Aaron was temporary. It was always going to be temporary. He wanted a lot of priests, and it was just, again, a provisional thing that Aaron and his progeny and the Levites had the corner on the market, as it were. Here's a guy who couldn't be a priest because he was crippled and he was dumb and blind or dumb and deaf and all the rest. So Jesus does something with his ears. Do you remember anything about ears in the Old Testament? Man, I can hear the wheels grinding on this. It's good. Yeah, no. I mean, you could probably look at it there, and I'm serious about this. Never leave a stone unturned. If you've got a little thing like that, pursue it out. This is a whole lot like what? That's it. Yeah. This is the new all, AWL. You're under slavery at this point. Fairly clear that this guy was, on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And again, as we've seen before, the people he heals in many ways embody the whole nation. Does he heal a lot of blind people? Yes. Why? Because that's a very good illustration of what Israel is like at this time. Messiah is standing right in front of you teaching, and you don't see him. Moreover, he's teaching away, and you don't hear him. So if you're a slave to a master, and you come out from under his ownership, they really didn't have chattel slavery like we do. It was more like an indentured servant, but you only lasted in that position for 7 years. Then you had to be turned loose. If you wanted to stay because you loved the master, and this is all in Leviticus and Numbers, you could opt to go stand at the doorway. I was going to do it, but I realized I'd lose the camera. Stand at the doorway, put your ear on the door, and he would take an awl, a punch, and punch your ear right at the doorway. When he pulled it out, you were born into that family. You were adopted in the family. Beautiful imagery. Beautiful imagery. And here is this guy who couldn't be a priest and is a slave to the socioeconomic condition and all things economic. He's now brought in, but that's what God was intending for all of Israel. You've been under the mastery of law. This is something Paul mentions often. The law has been your master. I'm ready to bring a new covenant, and you're going to be adopted in as children. So he's doing to this man what he is intending to do with the world. I want you to not be under slavery. I've come to bring you out of your slavery and into adoption. And when you're adopted, you get to sit at the dinner table. You're made, and it's the story of Mephibosheth at David. And notice what the next story is. The next story in Mark's gospel is the feeding of the 4,000. So we've got this little play going on here. Jesus is doing this as a prophetic sign act. In other words, he's enacting greater truths than what's on the surface. I'm going to make you children of God. I'm bringing in the conditions to do that, and you're going to be brought to the banqueting table. That's what happens with us. We're made sons and daughters of the King, and we get to eat at his table. That's what communion is. Glorious stuff. All of that in here? Yeah. And the priesthood, there's a story about ears from the priesthood. Do you remember anything about ears in the priesthood? To consecrate a priest, what do you have to do? Got to take some blood and dip it on their earlobe and on their thumbs and on their big toes. What's that got to do with the price of rice? It's an image of Jesus. When we come to Good Friday, you think of the wounds of Christ. It was on his head, so that blood dripped down, kind of this earlobe that's bloody. And he was wounded and pierced in his hands, and his feet were nailed. So Jesus bled from the head, the hands, and the feet, and that's what priests were imaging. Priests were to image that very thing. So this man, he's going through the paces of Jesus saying, yeah, we've got priests, but as you've been saying, they're not good for very much right now. It's a crooked priesthood. You know, the fact that they've set up business in the temple says our priesthood is out for the money. Stop me if it sounds vaguely familiar. Paid professional holy men who are ordained to a position wanting graft and money. Stop me. We were rehearsing this at lunch table. We were talking about some of the so-called brethren that drive around Rolls Royces, and Jim Morrow said, there's one guy in California that's got 7 Rolls Royces, preacher, one for each day of the week. So as John Clary has his Monday underwear and his Tuesday underwear, this guy's got them with Rolls Royces. Fascinating. Yeah, and they're there. So Jesus is going to start a new priesthood. We call it in Peter the priesthood of all believers. And so as I stand here in front of you, I recognize in God's eyes, I'm not the only ordained guy. We're all ordained by God and all priests in that we're able to offer up the worship of prayer, the giving of gifts. We're all able to do that. So I got nothing cornered. And again, I'm talking out of the COVID vaccination at this point. Let's get in a little further here. Do you think that the man, this deaf and dumb man, had faith prior to being brought to Jesus? Is there any indication that this guy was a believer? Probably not. Yeah, the condition itself would demand that he couldn't hear too much. Nobody's about to talk to him. I had I read an account of a guy who had just made a seminary position. He was a graduate student. They did the same thing they did to me, and that's hire him in. And one of the first calls he had, it sounds like he worked for the dean's office or something. One of the first calls he got was a really late night call, which are never good if you're around a college of any sort. And it was a brand new freshman from Japan who had come uh, to America to study some some cultural things. Here's the rub. He came down with excruciating stomach pains and had to be taken to the hospital. And the unfortunate thing was he was deaf and he knew sign language, but it wasn't American Sign Language. And have any of you ever been around deaf people, especially in a medical situation? They go into a wide-eyed panic because they're in a room with people who have their life in their hands, the doctors, the nurses, the specialists, and they're all talking, and that's all they see. They're seeing this or they're seeing this, and they're watching charts. I've been in that a couple of times, and some of the most frightened people I've ever seen were the deaf who didn't have a clue what was going on. Here's a man with a medical situation and all of this clamoring going around him, and they're dragging him before this absolutely unknown person. You can imagine perhaps some fear there. Why are they grabbing me? Generally, deaf men are not grabbed and carted around by, and when you see and put the Matthew part in it, where there were a lot of these kind of folks, some that were crippled, some that are blind. You're being herded into this group. You can imagine what the guy's thinking, or at least try to imagine what he's thinking. Go ahead, Steve.
For years. Every cargo ship that I flew onto, except for one or two, they were all foreign crews. And it was amazing to try to communicate with them. We went out one day and guy falling down the cargo 2 stories. And I got down on the boat, they lowered me down the boat, and I went to explain to the crew how we were gonna put him on the back. You know, you live here, and they're all shaking their heads, yeah, smile. And so I went to do it, and just picked the guy up and moved him over and threw him on the board. Well, his finger shot through his leg and everything else. But they kept bringing me sandbags the whole time and just handing them to me, smiling. And they were Vietnamese or whatever they were. And the whole time, and it ended up, because of the sea condition and everything else, there were real high seas. The helicopter wanted to do a trail line, they dropped a sandbag with a rope on it onto the deck. Then they move the helicopter off to the side and you pull the rope and then you pull the basket down to you. They said they understood, they never understood any of it. They tried 6 times, couldn't do it. So they just did direct delivery. But it's amazing how every crew, except for a British crew, how they don't speak English, and I don't speak Vietnamese or Korean or any of the other languages. It's so difficult to try to communicate with them when you can't.
And here is a situation that this man's clueless on. And even if he had seen Jesus, the only time he had been in the area was the Gadarene demoniac. Mm-hmm. So whatever else this guy is working with, a whole bunch of darkness, I don't want you to think that there's prior faith or prior experience in this guy. That may bring out then another aspect to the finger in the ear and him spitting and putting it on his tongue. What might that also be for this man? Pardon me? Reassuring, yes. Plus, if you can't hear, I can't explain to you. There's a lot of clamor. This guy's probably white-knuckled and wide-eyed about this, seeing all this stuff going on around him. Nobody's ever paid attention to the guy. Now he's thrust into prominence here. what's Jesus also doing by putting his fingers in? Yes, reassurance, but by putting his fingers into his ears, is there anything the man might have picked up with that? I like it. I like that. I'd never thought of that. I've thought along the lines of, I'm going to fix this and I'm going to fix this. In other words, he's putting his finger on it. Again, this guy doesn't know who Jesus is, but Jesus has suddenly shown, I like that, Steve, a lot, shown his compassion. He's building, as it were, rapport, establishing some confidence. And yeah, this is how Jesus works. He's never abrupt. He's never harsh. He's gentle Jesus, as it says in Matthew's gospel. Good. Why the spit then? Let's think of that. Why the spit? And I've said it's probably an allusion to what we've seen a chapter and a half ago about nothing on the outside makes a man unclean. So this isn't unclean, folks, and he's showing that if in fact there are some Pharisees that have picked up the scent of Jesus being back into the region. He's showing that it's not the way, it's what's on the inside, what's on my insides, your insides, and your issues of blood, issues of seminal variety, issues of vomit, defecation, urination. Those are all defiling. Mine aren't. Why? Because out of my heart issues goodness. Also, what else could be in place here?
It's something from Jesus. That's his personal, who he is, where he's from. And
Keep going. And what has he said to us is going to come out of him? A river? You got it. I was helping you along. Yeah, there's going to be a river coming from him, meaning in John's Gospel, chapter 4 and chapter 7, the Spirit. And what does the Spirit do? Jesus's river that's starting, like Ezekiel 47 tells us, the little river, it starts as a trickle and becomes a great body of water by the time it hits the Dead Sea and brings life. Jesus's water, as it were, brings life. It's the water of life. This is Ponce de Leon's yeah, fountain of youth. It brings vitality. So that's all there. Could there be anything else? This is the mouth of God. Anything? Think Old Testament with the mouth of God. And people. Mouth of God and people. What was Adam made of? Dust and notice it shows up in our passage. Adam was created out of dust, but he wasn't alive when. And so now, here in this way, he breathes deep, sigh, and he says, Ephphatha, be open. He gives a command with that breath. Is it there? I don't know. I'm just exploring. I'm trying to show you the God of the Old Testament has shown up in flesh, and the God of the Old Testament who created Adam and breathed into him the breath of life is now breathing on this man, and he's a new creature. And I mean that in every sense of the word. This could be, and don't think Jesus did things only once. I think this is maybe a preview of coming attractions as well, when in John chapter 20, and we will get there one day, fellas. I know all of you Wednesday nighters are still doing this, and I get it. I understand. When he is in the upper room and he breathes on them and says, receive the Spirit. And they receive the Spirit. It's called the doctrine of insufflation. I like just throwing that around because I don't know. It says maybe I did show up at class once or twice and I learned something. The is insufflation. He breathes out so I get to breathe in. And isn't this a sign of death? If you've ever been around a dead or a dying person, somebody who's taken their last breath, they don't do this when they die. No, that's what little Connor Jack did the other day. A baby that is connected to the Bible studies up in Galloway that some of the fellas know. She finally gave birth after 41 weeks of pregnancy. Connor Jack is his name. And what Connor Jack did in the labor delivery room in Atlantic Care was do this. He breathed. And what my father-in-law did last May in our living room was this. Jesus dies, gives up the spirit. That's what we say on Good Friday. We'll remember spirit and breath and wind are all the same word. He gave up his breath in order for us to go and live just like creation week. Does that make sense? All right. It's unusual. It really is. And I know it and you know it. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Can you make a comment that this guy didn't have faith, which is why Jesus actually said, be open, where in the previous one, he always says, faith that made full.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's there. And it's, oh, absolutely. This has got the Pharisees written all over it. He's touching this guy. He's spitting on people. You know, everything disgusting as far as the Pharisees. And again, remember, at his feet, according to Matthew, are all of these misfits, these unfortunates, these cast off, and he's gravitating to this trauma unit, as it were. And folks are clamoring and they're saying audacious things like, praise God for this. They're probably bleeding from their cheeks because they bit into it so deep and they don't know what to do about it. It's just out of control as far as they're concerned. But yes, you're absolutely right. And what does this guy do? You know, don't know, but I have a feeling he believed from that point on. Now, let me throw this one in before we turn the page. Why does Jesus take him off to the side? We had mentioned that, but I think it's worth mentioning again. Jesus takes him out of the crowd. So that's one of the reasons Mark picks this one up. Apparently, Matthew's got the crowd scene, and Jesus picks this guy up, and there are others there, it says. They heard what was going on, so maybe it was the disciples, but it's just pretty much a private thing. Why? Go ahead. You got it. I know what you're going to say, so go ahead and say it.
Well, it goes back to where you go out and preach and you open.
Yes.
And you're not supposed to, you're supposed to go into, your own room and pray. I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
As far as bringing him in, understand, see what's been done, or what's going to be done, and not something where it's there just
This is where I thought your discussion at the lunch table was fascinating when you told us about the mysteries of the museum. The faith healers today want to do it where? Where do they want their work? Out in the open. Why? Why out in the open? You got it. And for the show and for renown, and it's great advertisement, and Jesus wasn't about it. He knows full well the hearts of men and women. He knows if I do this enough, that's all they'll be here for. They're already at the feeding of the 5,000 saying, hey, stick around, this is great. We'll never have to cook or earn a, isn't that what we want? Isn't that what we want for politicians? Work it so I don't have to work. Give me everything I need. It's no different. This is a apparently a welfare society in the making, to have a king who gives you everything you need. Boy, that's the kind of king we all want. So he's showing them he's not going to do this for the show and not going to use miracles in order to get great PR generated. So, that's there. Plus, then, again, the reason he meandered around geographically to get there, he's not wanting this to get out of control. And if there were some Pharisees in the crowd, and I have a hard time believing they're not monitoring every time this guy shows up, they're looking for a crowd to gather. It's got to be Jesus in the middle of it, and they'll beat tail to get over to it. And when they get over to it, they're apparently keeping court records on it. And he's avoiding that too. I don't want him being made a spectacle of. This is like the woman who had the issue of blood for 12 years. He talked to her publicly, but to the little girl that was the 12-year-old that had died, he kept that one privately. So there's a personal touch here. This guy may have needed a personal touch. If in fact he's white-knuckled and wide-eyed over this whole spectacle, Jesus, in his love, takes him to the side and says, I'm going to fix it. You'll be better. And breathes on him. That's Jesus. He deals with this on the same basis. And notice this. This Sunday, Lord willing, we're going to start a service. And though it would be tempting to have communion on this Sunday, I've decided for some expeditious reasons to wait for a couple of weeks. But look at us. Whatever else we are, I hope you'll apply it if I use me. That way I'm not threatening any of you. What am I? I'm a typical Christian. I'm crippled, I'm blind, I'm helpless and naked, I'm all of those things, and he picks me to adopt me and sits me at a table. So there is an image here that says this is exactly the normal with Jesus. He makes worshipers out of these kind of people. So again, the passage that you landed on, Teresa, in Matthew, and they were amazed and praised God. Yeah, that's what we're doing. He's lifted us out of our junk and made us a kingdom of priests, and we can now serve him and eat at his table. Yeah. And the same passage, by the way, same passage that prohibited crippled, deformed people from being priests in the Old Testament. Also, though, if they were in the line of being priests, they couldn't be there with the deformity and things, but they could eat at the table. They were allowed to eat the king's bread. Fascinating. Let's go on for the last 10 or so minutes into the next passage, which is the feeding of the 4,000. Mark chapter 8, verses 1 to 13. Anybody want to read for us there? Are you picking these side voices up at the microphone, Chris? If they read, are you going to hear it? Yeah. Okay. Then in Mark 8, 1 to 13. Any volunteers read? Teresa's playing the trombone, meaning her arms can't get long enough for her to read. I can see that. Anyone? Then let you read. Go ahead, Steve. You're going to read, go.
I can't read, but anyway. In those days, the multitude being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called upon his disciples unto him, and said unto them, I have compassion. I lost it.
Can I pick it up?
Yeah.
Okay. I have compassion for these people. Listen to it. They have already been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also, and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present, and having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went into the region of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. There it is, Jen. To test him, they asked for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth. No sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. What do you see here? Anything? Just as an aside for our lunch comment, here's one of those passages that gives us those little tiny details that say this was eyewitness. In the feeding of the 5,000, it's very clear that he had them sit down in the green grass. In this one, the feeding of the 4,000, he has them sit down on the ground. That may seem small and insignificant, but here again, in those days, grass sprung up just for a short period in the spring with the spring rains. This is probably later on in and closer to midsummer, probably. And that it was not green grass they were going to sit down in, it's going to be on the ground. Those little details then mean something, you know. And we're dealing with different size lunches. The first time they got a little boy's 5 pita bread, these seem to be loaves of bread, and as many fish, you know, 5 loaves, 2 fish kind of thing. We get in the feeding of 5,000, it's 7 loaves and an interminable amount of fish that come out of people's pockets and what have you. Anything interesting in the setup on this? Jesus starts out by making note of a couple of things. Crowd had gathered, a large crowd had gathered. Steve read that part. He calls his disciples to him, verse 2. I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. If I send them home, they'll die of starvation because they've gone 3 days. Man, I can't even go 3 hours without eating. I don't know if I'm, you know, just the exception to the rule. Don't answer that, Clary. I don't want to hear from you. I know what you're going to say. The point is what? Again, this is the same area that had driven Jesus out by almost tar and feathering him and riding him out on the rail. This is the same area. They're not only bringing in large groups from a great distance, they go 3 days without eating. It does, doesn't it? Imagine that, huh? Yeah. 3, and a meal. 3 days and a meal. Yeah. Don't miss that in Holy Week. Meals and Jesus go together. It's why all of us are so portly and really in good communion with one another and the Lord. Anything else? As we're kind of
Bless the food before them distribute it.
Does that sound like anything else you've heard? The night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread, blessed it, gave thanks and said, "This is my body." Yeah, Mark is intentionally wanting you to hear some sacramental language to this. This is manna. If you're going to glance back into the Old Testament, God providing bread for his people. This is in the banquet that we have, the new manna, and Jesus providing the communion meal for us. Yeah. Good catch again. Anything else?
But you got set up.
He then does what he did at feeding the 5,000. He's got compassion on them, and I always want to mention this because
It's just an interesting.
little doodad of detail. The word compassion in Greek, it's a compound word. Listen to it. If you're not careful, you'll spit on your shirt.
Pronounce it. It's eusplunkna.
Slankna. Euslankna. It's a compound word. The U part is EU in Greek. It's the prefix for good. Splankna is intestines. Compassion means you got good intestines. This is where a lot of the older English translations give you that really strange bald spot scratching expression. Jesus' bowels stirred within him. You ever come across that one? You've not read the older English translation. Yeah, because they knew Slankna, then it's King James that does his bowels stirred within him. They knew that Splankna is the Greek word for intestines, so they tried to figure it out. We now say with compassion. But think of it, I gave this to my seminary students when we were discussing love the Lord, your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I said their understanding of biology in the ancient Near Eastern world is different from ours. They thought that this was the seat of compassion. And it's not foreign to us. If we were to go out here in a few minutes to the parking lot and he falls and takes, a skinned knee on the curb, usually we feel it here. If it's a kid, we really feel it here. And we even have the expression, that's gut-wrenching. Or I have a gut feeling. That's this word. Jesus looks at this massive group of people, and he probably hears their stomachs growling after 3 days, and he's feeling compassion on them. These folks are really desperate. Again, this is Jesus. Remember, he's probably gone 3 days without eating himself. That's not unusual for Jesus. He's been meeting the needs. So all of those cripples and limping, deaf, blind folks, he's been healing them probably round the clock. It's a 72-hour hospital rounds kind of thing. You think of it that way? How is Jesus' compassion going to translate into action? This is where I was headed. What does he do? How does he get this group fed? Well, he had to get it first. How is he going to get food? Who does he ask to feed them? That's the question I think I need to ask. Who does he ask to feed them? Yeah. Have we ever been in this position before? He turns to his disciples, and in John's Gospel, the feeding of the 5,000, it gives you that little parenthetical whisper on the side. Oh, by the way, he says, I want you to feed them. And they say, well, 8 months' wages could feed this group. And it says on the side, he said this in order to test them. Apparently, that was their midterm exam. Just weeks after that, here comes the final exam. And he says, guys, go ahead and feed this group. Let's show them hospitality. Let's show them that we care for the whole people. We've been straightening out their limbs and unplugging their ears and giving sight to their eyes. Let's take care of their bellies. Yeah, that's temporary. We've been dealing with the eternal, but the temporary is just as important. That's why the feeding ministry of this church is so significant. People will not listen to the gospel if they're perishing of hunger. And is there hunger in Cape May? Absolutely, and there is in Atlantic. And yeah, thank you. Well, I won't go political here, but you get the idea. The point is what? He goes right back to it. It's the same question. And what did they answer this time? Where are we going to get it? Where are we going to go? There's
a convenience store, but I don't know if you know this, Jesus, but
they not opened up the first Wawa or Quick Check. You guys know this, that Stop and Shop and A&P are merging. Did you know this? It's going to be called Stop and P. So enough of that. What's that? Yeah, I got 2 minutes here. Let me go one more step. They say, we can't do it. Sound familiar? They did about as well with feeding the 4,000 as they did feeding the 5,000. In other words, beats us. We don't know what we're going to do. What's the problem with that? Had they seen anything like this before? And in the last minute, I'll ask the big question. Does God ever have to teach us more than once on things? Yeah. If I were to fault the disciples, understand that I'm just accusing my own miserable self. You know how many times I've had to step in the landmine field and walk and find, yeah, that's me. I will go back to the old things every time if God didn't prevail and persevere. We'll keep it going next week, Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise. We'll come back to the feeding of the 4,000. There's some other things here. A smaller group, but more leftovers, as if to say, if you didn't get it the first time, remember we had a storm on the sea, well, the baskets were at your feet, fellas. Well, we're going to climb into the boat again. Notice that one, just like feeding the 5,000. And there's even more, because the word for basket has changed. No big deal. Let me close with prayer right at that mark. Father in heaven, thank you for the story of the deaf and dumb man being healed, because that's us. It's me. I don't always hear what the Spirit wants to say to the churches, even to the individual. But you've told us, he who has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says. Give us those kind of ears. Heal our ears, so that we hear you above the tumult and the sheer shrillness of the world around us. Help us to hear you in the face of viruses and landmark legal wranglings and civil unrest and all the rest, Lord. The world screams to get our attention. We want to hear you. Speak to us from your word. Whatever else words do, they are audible, and you talk to us, and we want to hear. And as well, touch our tongues so that we share the good news and tell the story. Whatever Resurrection Sunday was, the angels put it in 4 simple words. Come see, go tell. We want to see, we want to hear, and we also want to tell. Help us to tell the story of Jesus and to share it wherever you send us. Thank you for my brothers and sisters. Thank you for this day. We're grateful. We give you thanks in Jesus. Amen.